He was accused of something he didn't do. And before the sun rose the next morning, his name had already been turned into a crime. In the summer of 1912, in a small farming town outside Macon, Georgia, a 27-year-old man named Isaiah Turner was known for keeping to himself. He worked long hours on a cotton farm owned by a wealthy landowner named Harold Whitmore. Isaiah wasn't rich. He didn't have power, but he had a reputation for being honest, quiet, and hardworking. Most people in the black community respected him, and even some white townspeople admitted he caused no trouble. At first, it didn't seem like anything would ever change, but things quickly did. On the evening of July 18th, a white woman named Clara Whitmore, Harold's niece, claimed she had been attacked on the edge of town. She said the man who approached her was black. She didn't give a name. She didn't describe his face clearly. But that didn't seem to matter. Within hours, rumors began to spread. A group of men gathered outside the Whitmore estate. Voices grew louder. Stories became more exaggerated. By midnight, one name started circulating: Isaiah Turner. No one could say exactly how his name came up. Some said a farmhand mentioned seeing him nearby earlier that day. Others claimed Clara had whispered his name privately. Even though there was no evidence, Isaiah became the focus. The next morning, 2 deputies arrived at his small wooden home. Isaiah didn't run. He didn't resist. He stepped outside calmly, confused, but cooperative. They told him he needed to answer some questions. He agreed. As they walked him through town, people began to notice. Men stopped what they were doing. Women stepped out onto their porches. The whispers started again. That's him. That's the one. By the time Isaiah reached the jailhouse, a crowd had already begun to form. First, it was small, but as the hours passed, it grew. Inside the jail, Isaiah sat alone. He repeated the same thing over and over. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even seen Clara that evening. The sheriff seemed uncertain. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, no clear timeline. But outside, the mood was changing. A mob of men had gathered. Some carried rifles. Others brought ropes. And they weren't interested in waiting. As the situation escalated, pressure began to build on the sheriff. Voices outside demanded justice. But what they meant was something else entirely. By late afternoon, the crowd had grown into the hundreds. Men from nearby towns had arrived. Word had spread quickly. Some came out of anger. Others came out of curiosity. But most came because they believed something had to be done. Inside the jail, Isaiah could hear them. The shouting, the footsteps, the tension. For the first time, he began to understand what was happening. At first, it didn't seem real. But as the noise grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. That evening, the sheriff made a decision. He quietly moved Isaiah to a back cell. He told him it was for his safety. But even then, it was clear the situation was slipping out of control. Around 9 p.m., the mob made their move. They surrounded the jailhouse. Some men forced their way inside. Others stood guard outside. The sheriff tried to intervene. He told them to leave. He told them to wait for a proper investigation. But his voice was drowned out. Within minutes, they found Isaiah. They dragged him from the cell. He didn't fight. He kept asking one question. Why? No one answered. They pulled him through the streets. People watched from a distance. Some turned away. Others stood still, silent. As they reached the edge of town, the crowd grew quieter. The shouting stopped. The energy shifted. This was no longer chaos. It was something else. They brought him to a large oak tree. The same tree that had stood there for decades. The same tree everyone in town knew. For a moment, everything slowed down. Isaiah stood there, surrounded. He looked around, searching for something, someone, anyone. But there was nothing. No help, no intervention, just silence. They placed the rope around his neck. And in that moment, he stopped asking questions. The night air was still. No one spoke. And then, it was over. No trial, no evidence, no justice, just a decision made by a crowd. The next morning, The town woke up as if nothing had happened. The trees stood the same. The roads were quiet. But something had changed. In the days that followed, no arrests were made. No investigations were opened. Clara Whitmore never publicly identified Isaiah as her attacker. In fact, she stopped speaking about the incident entirely. Even though there was no evidence, Isaiah Turner was gone. As the situation settled, some members of the black community began to leave town. Families packed their belongings. Shops closed. People disappeared quietly. One by one, fear had taken hold, and it stayed. Harold Whitmore never addressed what happened. The sheriff remained in his position. Life continued, but Isaiah's name slowly faded. Years passed. New stories replaced old ones. And eventually, it was as if he had never existed. But there was one detail that never fully made sense. Weeks after the incident, a traveling merchant passing through town claimed he had seen a man matching Clara's description of the attacker, miles away from Macon, on the same night Isaiah was accused. The claim was dismissed. No one followed up. No one investigated. And the story disappeared, just like Isaiah. But years later, a letter surfaced. It was unsigned, undated, and inside it was a single line that raised more questions than answers. I know who really did it, and it wasn't him. The identity of the writer was never confirmed. The truth was never officially uncovered. And the man who was blamed never got the chance to defend himself. But what makes this story even more unsettling is what happened next. Because Isaiah Turner wasn't the only one connected to that night, and someone else was about to step forward. But when they did, everything the town thought it knew would begin to fall apart. And the truth was far worse than anyone expected. For years, no one spoke about what happened that night. Isaiah Turner's name had already faded from most conversations. In public, people avoided it. In private, some pretended it never happened. But not everyone moved on. In the fall of 1914, nearly 2 years after Isaiah's death, a man named Samuel Carter returned to Macon. Samuel was 33 years old. He had grown up in the same town as Isaiah. The two men weren't close, but they knew each other. Samuel had left Georgia shortly after the incident. Like many others, he didn't feel safe staying. But something brought him back. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. He kept a low profile, rented a small room, took work as a laborer near the railroad tracks. Most people didn't pay attention to him. But Samuel wasn't there to rebuild his life. He was there because of something he had seen, something he had never spoken about, and something he could no longer ignore. On the night Isaiah was taken from the jail, Samuel had been nearby, not in the crowd, not part of the mob, but close enough to see and hear more than most. At the time, he stayed silent, because speaking up back then came with consequences. But now, something had changed, and Samuel had decided it was time. A few days after returning, he went to the church on the edge of the black community. It was one of the few places people still gathered openly. Inside, he met with a small group of men, older men, respected men. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't rush. But when he told them what he had seen that night, the room went quiet. At first, it didn't seem believable. But Samuel didn't hesitate. He described the moment the mob entered the jail. He described who was there. And more importantly, he described someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A man who had never been mentioned. A man with influence. A man with power. According to Samuel, this man wasn't just present. He was giving orders. The same man who, publicly, had never been linked to the mob. The same man who later claimed he had nothing to do with what happened. As the situation unfolded inside that small church, the weight of Samuel's words became clear. If what he was saying was true, then Isaiah Turner's death wasn't just the result of a mob. It was organized, planned, and possibly protected. At first, the men urged Samuel to stay quiet. They had seen what happened to people who spoke too much. But Samuel refused. He had carried this for 2 years, and he wasn't leaving again without saying it. Word began to spread quietly, not across the whole town, just within the community. People started asking questions again. Names that had been buried started resurfacing. And one name kept coming up: Harold Whitmore, the same man who owned the land Isaiah worked on, the same man whose niece made the accusation. According to Samuel, Whitmore had been near the jail that night, not just near it, inside it, directing men, telling them where to go, who to take, and how to handle it. Even though there was no official record, Samuel insisted he saw him clearly. At first, it didn't make sense. Why would a wealthy landowner involve himself in something like that? But as people began to look deeper, other details started to surface. In the weeks before Isaiah's arrest, there had been tension between him and Whitmore. Quiet tension, nothing public, but enough for people to notice. Isaiah had recently refused to sign a new labor contract, one that would have tied him to Whitmore's land for years. Some said he planned to leave town. Others said he had been encouraging other workers to do the same. At the time, it didn't seem important, but now it raised questions. Was Isaiah targeted? Was the accusation just a reason? As the situation escalated, Samuel decided to take a bigger risk. He wrote everything down: names, dates, what he saw, and he brought it to someone outside the community, a traveling journalist passing through Georgia. The man listened carefully. He asked questions, took notes, and promised to look into it. For the first time, there was a chance the story might go beyond the town. Days passed, then weeks. The journalist returned. But something was different. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't asking questions anymore. Instead, he warned Samuel, told him to stop, told him some stories weren't meant to be uncovered. That same night, Samuel noticed something strange. A man standing across the street from where he was staying. Watching, not moving, just watching. At first, it didn't seem serious, but things quickly changed. Over the next few days, Samuel realized he was being followed. Everywhere he went, someone was nearby. At the train station, at the market, even near the church. The message was clear. Someone knew what he was doing, and they didn't want him to continue. The men at the church told him to leave, said it wasn't worth it. But Samuel refused. He had come back for a reason, and he wasn't leaving without the truth being known. One evening, he decided to confront it. He walked toward the man who had been watching him, the same man he had seen multiple times. But as he got closer, the man turned and walked away. Samuel followed him, down a narrow road, past the edge of town, until they reached a place that hadn't been used in years. An old storage building. The door was slightly open. The man stepped inside, and for a moment, Samuel hesitated. Then he followed. Inside it was dark, quiet, too quiet. He took a few steps forward, and then he heard a voice. Not the man he followed, someone else. A voice he recognized, a voice he never expected to hear there. And in that moment, everything changed, because the person standing in the shadows was someone the town trusted, someone who had publicly denied any involvement. And as Samuel tried to process what he was seeing, the door behind him slowly closed, locking him inside. And whatever was about to happen next was never meant to be seen. But what they didn't know was that Samuel had already left something behind, something that could expose everything. And if it was found, it would reveal the truth about Isaiah Turner and everyone involved in his death. But before that could happen, someone else would have to discover it. And by the time they did, it might already be too late. The door shut with a dull thud. For a moment, no one moved. Samuel stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. He could hear breathing more than one person. And then the voice came again, calm, familiar. Shouldn't have come back, Samuel. As the shadows shifted, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't just anyone. It was Sheriff Daniel Reeves, the same man who had stood outside the jail that night, the same man who claimed he tried to stop the mob, the same man people trusted. At first, it didn't seem possible. Samuel stared at him, trying to understand. "You said you didn't know," Samuel said quietly. The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He just looked at him. Then slowly he sighed. "Some things are bigger than you think," he said. As the situation tightened inside that dark building, another man stepped forward. It was the one Samuel had been following. And behind them, two more figures. No uniforms, no badges, just men. The truth was no longer hidden. It was standing right in front of him. Samuel took a step back. "Isaiah didn't do anything," he said. The sheriff nodded slightly. "I know." For a brief second, everything went still. The air felt heavier. "You knew?" Samuel asked. No anger in his voice, just disbelief. The sheriff looked down, then back up. "It wasn't about what he did," he said. "It was about what he was becoming." The words hung in the air. Samuel didn't respond, but he understood. Isaiah wasn't just a farm worker anymore. He was influencing others, talking about leaving, refusing control. And in a town like that, that was enough. "So you let them kill him," Samuel said. The sheriff's face didn't change. "I didn't let anything happen," he replied. "I made sure it happened the right way." Silence, cold and heavy. Samuel's hands tightened. "And the accusation?" he asked. "The woman." For the first time, the sheriff hesitated. Then he glanced toward one of the men behind him. And that was all Samuel needed to see. It wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It was arranged, carefully, quietly, a story created so no one would question the outcome. Even though there was no evidence, they made sure no one would look for any. Samuel took another step back. "You're all involved," he said. No one denied it. No one needed to. First, it didn't seem real. But now, there was no confusion left. The sheriff stepped closer. "You came back digging into things that were buried," he said. "That's dangerous." Samuel looked around. For men, no way out. But he didn't panic, because he knew something they didn't. "I didn't come back empty," he said. The sheriff paused, just for a second. "What does that mean?" he asked. Samuel didn't answer. He just looked at him and smiled slightly. That was enough. The mood in the room shifted instantly. One of the men moved toward him. "Search him," the sheriff said. They checked his pockets. Nothing. No papers. No notes. Just a folded cloth and a small coin. The sheriff frowned. "You think this is a game?" he asked. Samuel shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I think it's over." Before anyone could react, a loud sound echoed from outside. A vehicle, then another. The men froze. The sheriff turned toward the door. "What is that?" one of them asked. Samuel didn't answer, because he already knew. Moments later, voices filled the air. Not a mob, not chaos, controlled, commanding. And then, a knock, firm, authoritative. The sheriff's face changed. For the first time, there was uncertainty. Another knock, louder. "Open the door." The voice was unfamiliar, not local, not from the town. Samuel finally spoke. "I told you, I didn't come back empty." The sheriff looked at him, then at the door, then back at the men. Everything was slipping. The door burst open. Light flooded the room, and standing there were three men in suits. Behind them, uniformed officers, not from Macon, state officials, and a man holding a notebook, the journalist, the same one who had warned Samuel. Except now, he wasn't warning anyone. He was documenting, taking notes, watching everything. The room fell silent. No one moved. The sheriff tried to speak, but the words didn't come. One of the officials stepped forward. "Sheriff Daniel Reeves," he said calmly. "We're going to need you to come with us." The men behind him didn't resist. They couldn't. Not anymore. As the situation unfolded, everything that had been hidden began to surface. The statements, the names, the connections. And for the first time, people were being held accountable. Weeks later, the story spread beyond Georgia. Newspapers picked it up. Details emerged. Not just about Isaiah Turner, but about a pattern. Other names, other incidents, other truths. The town could no longer pretend. The silence was broken, the system exposed, and slowly justice began to take shape. But it didn't come easily, because even as arrests were made and testimonies were taken, there were still gaps, still questions. One of the biggest was Clara Whitmore, the woman whose accusations started everything. She had disappeared, left town quietly, no statement, no explanation, nothing. At first, it didn't seem important, but as investigators dug deeper, they found something unexpected. A document, hidden among old records, a signed statement, not public, not filed properly, but real. And in that statement, Clara admitted something no one saw coming, something that changed the entire story, something that raised even more questions. Because if what she wrote was true, then Isaiah Turner wasn't just innocent. He was chosen, and there was someone else who should have been standing in his place. Someone still out there, someone who had never been named. And as the truth came closer to the surface, it became clear this story wasn't over, because what Clara revealed pointed to a secret far bigger than one town, and uncovering it would change everything. But that truth was still waiting to be found. Months passed, but the story refused to fade. The arrests had shaken the town. For the first time, names that once carried power were being questioned. Sheriff Daniel Reeves was no longer in uniform. The men who stood beside him that night were now facing charges. But even with everything that had come to light, something still didn't feel complete. Because one question remained. Who was the man Clara Whitmore was protecting? Investigators went back through every detail, every statement, every timeline, every witness account, and slowly, a pattern began to form. Clara hadn't just made an accusation. She had been guided. Her story had changed slightly each time she told it. Small details didn't match. Moments didn't line up. At first, it didn't seem serious. But as the inconsistencies grew, so did the suspicion. And then, they found it. A letter, hidden inside a box of old belongings recovered from the Whitmore estate. It was written in Clara's handwriting, addressed to someone, but never sent. The date was just days after Isaiah Turner's death. The room went quiet as it was read. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," the letter began. "They told me it would scare him, that it would make him leave." No name was mentioned, but the message was clear. Clara hadn't acted alone. She had been influenced, directed, and whoever was behind it had never been questioned. As the investigation continued, attention turned back to Harold Whitmore. But this time, they looked deeper, not just at his public life, but at his connections, business records, private dealings, land agreements, and what they found changed everything. Whitmore wasn't just a landowner. He had been quietly expanding his control, buying land from struggling families, forcing others into contracts they couldn't escape. And in several cases, those who refused didn't stay long. Some left suddenly. Others disappeared from records entirely. Isaiah Turner wasn't the first. He was just the one that got attention. As the situation escalated, a new name surfaced. A man who had never been mentioned before. A man who didn't live in the town, but had influence over it. His name was never spoken publicly. Not at first, but behind closed doors, investigators began to focus on him. Because according to Clara's letter, he was the one who suggested everything. The accusation, the timing, the pressure, and most importantly, the outcome. Weeks later, a quiet warrant was issued. Not for Whitmore, but for this unknown man. And when they finally tracked him down, he didn't deny it. At least, not completely. He admitted to knowing Whitmore, admitted to discussing Isaiah. But when it came to the accusation, he stayed silent, refused to answer. And that silence said more than anything else. As the truth continued to unfold, the case grew bigger than anyone expected. Newspapers began calling it one of the most organized acts of injustice the region had ever seen. People started looking back at other cases, other names, other stories that had been ignored, and one by one, they began to connect. What happened to Isaiah Turner wasn't random. It was part of something larger, something planned, something repeated. For years, back in Macon, the town was no longer the same. The silence was gone. In its place was tension, questions, and a truth that could no longer be hidden. The oak tree still stood, unchanged, but now, people saw it differently, not as a landmark, but as a reminder of what happened when power goes unchecked, a reminder of how quickly truth can be buried, and how long it can take to uncover it. As for Isaiah Turner, his name returned, not in whispers, but in records, in articles, in conversations. For the first time, he wasn't just a story. He was a person, a man who never got justice, but whose truth refused to disappear. And yet, even after everything, there was still one detail that didn't sit right, because despite the arrests, despite the evidence, the man Clara wrote about was never fully exposed. His name was never released to the public. His identity kept sealed. Some said it was to protect an ongoing investigation. Others believed it was to protect something else, something bigger, because if that name ever came out, it wouldn't just affect one town. It would reach far beyond it. And maybe that's why it was never spoken. Even now, some records remain incomplete, some files still closed, and some truths still hidden. But one thing is certain. What happened to Isaiah Turner was never just about one man. It was about a system that believed it could decide who mattered and who didn't. And for a long time, it almost got away with it. But stories like this have a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply they're buried. And sometimes, the truth doesn't just bring answers. It brings consequences. So the question is, how many more stories like this were never uncovered? How many names were lost the same way? And how many truths are still waiting to be revealed? If the story made you think, or left you with questions, let me know in the comments. Do you believe justice was ever truly served? Or was this just the surface of something deeper? Don't forget to like and share this video so more people can hear stories like this, and subscribe for more untold histories that deserve to be remembered.